Welcome, everybody. I'm so glad to see you all here. This has been a pivotal year in the history of the Odell Rochambeau Headquarters. It was the year that the town government stepped forward to take ownership and committed to saving the house and restoring it. Paul Feiner and Francis Sheehan of the town board are here tonight, and I welcome them and thank them for all their efforts. It was also the year that the Friends of Odell House was formed to help the town in that effort. So why is this house so important? Why should we care about a boarded up old house when there are so many other needs in town? Hopefully you'll know the answers by the end of the evening. Let's start with a physical description of the house. The original section of the house is the middle part right here. It was built in 1732, which is also the year that George Washington was born. The second section of the house was here. It was not a full 2 stories. It was another salt box, just like this one. And that was built in 1760. In 1785, the second floor was added. And the final section of the house over here was built in 1855. The amazing thing about this house is that everything in it is as it was the day it was built. It's never been modernized. It doesn't have any heat, it doesn't have any plumbing, and it doesn't have any electricity. So when you go to restore it, you're not taking away a lot of modern things. You're actually going to be able to see the floorboards and the mantels and begin with the real story that's there right now. Let's talk about the history of the house and what happened in it and around the town. John Tompkins built the first Dutch salt box. It was similar to this one. This is from Massachusetts, but this is what a salt box looks like. It has this very slanted roof here and a very deep slanted roof in the back. He built the first part, as I said, in 1732. John was a descendant of one of the founders of the Eastchester colony that was chartered in 1664. By the early 18th century, the Eastchester colony had grown so much that its members spread throughout Westchester. John came to Greenburgh, which was then known as Phillipsburg Manor. Phillipsburg Manor began down here at Spuyten Duyvil in the Bronx, and it went all the way up here to the Croton River in Sleepy Hollow. It went as far east as the Bronx River and as far west as the Hudson. It covered 81 square miles of land. It was owned by one man who started accumulating the land in 1653. He came here as a carpenter to Peter Stuyvesant. And he was lucky enough to marry a very wealthy widow, and she helped him acquire the land so that by the beginning of the 18th century, he had these 81 square miles, which was 90,000 acres. What do we think that would be worth today? Although the Dutch lost New Amsterdam in 1665, he was able to maintain very good relations with the British, and he kept acquiring the land. John Tompkins leased 296 acres from him in 1732. This would be right around here where he leased it. This little red arrow is where the Odell House. He built that little salt box, and he lived there during the week, surrounded by very friendly Native Americans. There were 2 large Native American settlements, one down here, an area called 30 Deer Run, which is now where the Toll Brothers development is, and the other over here where Hillard Day Camp is now. He lived there by himself during the week. On the weekends, he would go back home to his wife in the Eastchester colony. But he came back, and the farm prospered, and by 1740, he had built himself another house, a substantial one that still stands today on South Healy Avenue, right near Sunningdale Golf Course. By 1760, he had sold the house to a man named Gilbert Bates and his wife, and they were the ones who built this second salt box. So from 1760 on, you had a structure that looked like this with a roof over here. Gilbert Bates and his wife lived there happily from 1760 on. But in the wider world, the French and Indian War had ended, and France had lost all of its colonies in the New World. The colonists no longer needed the British to defend them, so they began to resent paying for all the troops that were stationed in North America. George III imposed tax after tax, and we can flash forward to the Boston Tea Party and the first battle at Lexington and Concord. This is a map going back here. Now we have Gilbert Bates owning the Odell House. We have John Tompkins, and over here a name most of you will recognize, John Hart, had a farm that began here at the Bronx River and went just over to the other side of what is now Central Avenue. You also see the name Underhill. All of these now are known as street names in Greenburgh. So in 1775, the First Continental Congress convened in Philadelphia. Debates were held about the best course of action. Should they negotiate or should they try for independence? They decided that they needed a commander-in-chief, and in June of 1775, George Washington accepted that title. By the time he arrived in Boston, the Battle of Bunker Hill had been fought. It was basically our loss, but the casualties on the British side were very, very heavy. They lost over 2,000 men, and they actually abandoned Boston and left it to George Washington. So there he was. He had won. He had an army of 18,000 men. They were from all parts of the 13 colonies. In New England, they were ragtag militias without uniforms. From the South came perfectly uniformed Southern cavalry, and they didn't really get along. In fact, there's a wonderful story, well, maybe not so wonderful, but there's a story that Washington himself had to break up a brawl held in the middle of Harvard Yard between the Southern and the Northern militias. Finally, he was able to begin to form them into an army, but he had no cannons, no military engineers, and 36 barrels of gunpowder. That was it. That was all he had to fight the British. Disease and lack of discipline were very difficult, and he was constantly on call patrolling his troops. However, he and Martha left Boston, and by July 9th, they came to New York, where the Declaration of Independence was read on the steps of New York City Hall. On July 11th, it was read on the steps of the White Plains City Hall, and we actually, in the county, still have, under lock and key, that original copy of the Declaration that was read in 1776. While the Declaration was being read, however, this was occurring in Manhattan. The first of 479 ships arrived in Manhattan Harbor. They disgorged what was described as the largest invasion force Britain had ever assembled onto Staten Island. From then on, George Washington had to confront overwhelmingly superior forces. The Battle of Long Island, or Brooklyn, occurred in August. The Continental troops began to flee ahead of the British occupation in Manhattan in September. Washington moved farther and farther north and now came into Westchester. He followed this route here, which basically follows Old Army Road, the White Plains Post Road. This is Odell House, and he went up to White Plains, where the Battle of White Plains was fought in October of 1776. Washington lost New York City. He retreated with his troops into northern Westchester. The British held all of Manhattan, and Washington crossed the Delaware on Christmas Day, that famous painting of 1776. So let's leave him in New Jersey for a while and look at what it was like to live in Westchester. From Kingsbridge in the Bronx, which was under British control, to the Patriot forces in North Castle, Westchester was called the neutral ground. It was a time of intense hardship for all who lived here. I'm going to read a quote that I found just the other day. The appellation of neutral ground is commonly applied to all this region, but it is a strange misnomer. For from the beginning to the end of the Revolution, partisan warfare so waged here that it may well best be said that every field was embattled, every rock a fortress, every highway and byway was a line of assault or retreat. Nowhere else was the country so devastated, nowhere greater suffering, severer trials, but to the everlasting praise of the patriots of this manor be it said, they yielded not. Their endurance was like the granite of these hills. That's from 1894. I love that prose. The neutral ground was actually talked about in James Fenimore Cooper's famous book, The Spy. This portrays, we don't know, was it a British soldier or whether it was a rogue group of patriots coming to steal everything that the local farmer and his wife had. The British governor in New York was Lord Tryon Park. He believed that the best way to subdue the patriots was to burn as many of their houses as he could. If you remember that movie with Mel Gibson, The Patriot, you'll recognize the name Bannister Tarleton. With the loyalist Sheriff Delancey, Tarleton led British troops raging through the towns of Westchester, seeking patriots and destroying their homes and crops. In 1779, they burned every house in Bedford save one. In the neutral ground of Westchester, the British, known as the Cowboys, and rogue patriots, known as the Skinnards, foraged for their troops, and the residents lived in terror of losing their crops and animals every day. This is supposedly James Delancey, who was the leader of the Loyalist troops, and he is leading a bunch of cattle that he has stolen from the local people in Westchester, hence the name Cowboy. In the early 20th century, a house on Westchester Avenue on Hartsdale Avenue, where the Country Club apartment building is today, was owned by the Harts. It was found to have a secret room where livestock and supplies could be hidden when troops appeared. Over in Irvington, Jonathan Odell, the father of our John Odell, was the owner of a popular drover's tavern on Broadway. I think I have a picture of that. No, I don't. Okay. He was arrested in 76 and imprisoned by the British. While he was in prison, the British cut down his orchard, burned the wheat, and killed all his hogs, leaving the women of the family destitute. After the war, he submitted a plea to the new government, and they compensated him for his losses. Jonathan Odell and his wife, Margaret Dyckman, are the patriarchs of the Odells of our house in Hartsdale. They had 11 children, 5 sons and 6 daughters. Just before the Battle of Long Island in 1776, 2 of their sons, John, age 19, and Abraham, age 17, enlisted in the Continental Army. They signed on under a large whitewood tree in Tarrytown, later to become known as Andre's Tree, after Major Andre, under the watchful eye of that notorious cowboy. Whoops, sorry. We've gone the wrong way here. Delancey, there he is. John quickly distinguished himself, and by January of 77, he was appointed as a guide for the American Army under General Lincoln. John was described as strong, energetic, and fast, standing 6 feet tall with long limbs. In action, he was resolute and cool. An expert with a horse and a saber, he could strike pursuers at a great distance. There was a bounty on his head of 100 pounds. From 77 to 1780, John continued to serve in the Army and led many raids and skirmishes, often against Delancey and his raiders. They had a personal thing going on. There were a lot of descriptions of the 2 of them meeting, stealing each other's horses, trying to kill each other. Neither one of them succeeded, but it was part of the neutral ground escapades. Now let's move on to the most important event that occurred at Odell House, the Phillipsburg encampment and the French-American alliance. From the beginning of the war, the Founding Fathers knew that they needed the support of other nations. As early as March of 76, Benjamin Franklin and John Adams were in Paris negotiating with Louis XVI and the court. Many French nobles were enamored of the ideals of the Age of Enlightenment that they saw embodied by the patriot cause. Franklin went to court at Versailles wearing a coonskin cap instead of a wig to emphasize that image. I think we might prefer that to these long wigs that the French noblemen wore. When the Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th of 76, Louis XVI finally knew he was no longer dealing with the rebellious subjects of another king, but with an independent nation. France approved the sum of over 1 million gold livres to buy arms and ammunition to send to the Continental Army. In Trumbull's famous painting of the victory of Saratoga in September of 77, which hangs in the rotunda of the U.S. Capitol, the cannon and all the arms are French. By February of 78, a treaty was signed between France and the United States to give more aid to the new nation. But the years 78 and 79 saw too many British victories. Washington was defeated in Pennsylvania. The British took Philadelphia. It looked bleak for the Patriots. Enter Lafayette. Lafayette went back to France and pled successfully to France to support the cause of the revolution. Everyone knew that more than arms were needed. After agreeing to send troops, the king elevated the Comte de Rochambeau to the rank of lieutenant general, and on May 5th, 1780, Rochambeau sailed from Brest with 7,000 sailors, 5,300 troops, and 450 officers. They arrived in Newport on July 11th, 1780. As soon as the French arrived, Washington and Rochambeau began a series of meetings to plan their campaign to weaken the British. They realized it was too late in the year to begin that campaign, but they planned to have the French march south to meet the Continental troops in 1781 in Greenburgh. Washington would set up his camp in Dobbs Ferry, and Rochambeau would headquarter in Hartsdale. There, Washington expected to plan his campaign to regain Manhattan Island. So here's Newport. They were to march down here. I'm sorry, this map is a little difficult to read. This would be basically Westchester. So they were going to march from here to here. Getting the French troops here meant moving over 5,000 men, at least 1,000 oxen, and another 1,000 horses over unmapped territory with limited or no roads. Think about that. General Rochambeau sent his quartermaster, the Count de Belleville, ahead to map out an itinerary from Newport south. The itineraries that de Belleville wrote have been saved in the journals of his aide and read like 18th century GPS. Picture Siri saying this. You cross a hollow and a brook and then a plain. You come to a place where the road divides in 3 directions. The right-hand road goes over the Bronx River and leads to the camp. You go up onto a height, you turn left, come to a ford, and there is General Rochambeau's headquarters, Odell House. These directions cover the complete march from Newport to Phillipsburg. Once the maps were drawn and supplies gathered, the huge force left Newport June 26, 1781. They covered 220 miles from Newport to Hartsdale in 11 days. Walking, many of them. This march has been described as the largest military movement ever achieved before the European theater of operations in World War II. Think of the logistics, think of the supplies. Rochambeau hired 344 local wagon drivers to haul the provisions on the march because the oxen did not speak French. After very long days of marching, fording streams, and climbing hills, the troops arrived in Hartsdale on July 6, 1781. Almost 400 men had collapsed from the heat. Remember, they were wearing proper French uniforms. Somebody said each uniform had up to 140 buttons, and they were made of wool. So needless to say, they collapsed. The Continentals, on the other hand, wore some loose trousers. Evidently, this shirt was really discarded in July. It was too hot, and they definitely didn't wear hats. Now we arrive back at that little cottage. By 1781, Gilbert Bates had disappeared. We don't know where he stood during the years Westchester was the neutral ground, but most reports say he was a loyalist and that he was tied to a horse and driven out of town. Sarah somehow became known as a widow. We don't know if she was or not. And she offered Rochambeau her farm as his headquarters. The 4-room house, you remember, the 2 salt boxes, had room only for the general and a few aides, but there were barns and outbuildings, and the other officers found quarters in neighboring houses. The French troops were spread out over an area extending from the Bronx River on the east to the Sprain Brook on the west. Here you can see this over here would be Odell House. Right here we have the Chevalier de Chastellux on South Healy Avenue. He took over that big house that John Tompkins had built himself in 1740. And down here, the quartermaster, the one who wrote the itineraries, was in Gilbert Underhill's house, which is now in private hands. Also, it's known as Underhill's Tavern. The main French forces were camped on Sunnydale Golf Course and Hartsbrook Park and my front yard. This is a treasure. This is actually a musket ball that we dug out of our front yard. If any of you in Greenburgh are gardeners, be careful what you dig, because we have found 3 of these in our front yard. And there are many other things we know that are hidden right under the surface in our property. We are extremely lucky. Oh, yeah, I need to show you where the Americans were. Sorry about that. This is the Hudson River. Right here we have where George Washington was, Appleby Farm. That's where WFAS's radio tower is now. And here we have Odell House. They were only about a mile apart. And the French forces were all around here. And the American forces went all the way over to the Hudson River. They were camped on what is today Ardsley High School. They probably went into Ferncliff Cemetery and all the way up and down these hills. We're extremely lucky to have the journals of 2 of the young French officers to tell us what life was like in the rolling hills and the green plains. A man named Jean-Francois Clermont-Crèvecoeur wrote on July 7th of his experience spending the night in a meadow. I noticed that the top of the grass was covered with sparks. At first, I attributed this to the heat, but I did not long persist in the error, for I saw that the sparks were created by a fly that imitates our glowworms. The English call it a firefly, or mouche de feu. I have fireflies all over my yard in July and August. I don't know about the rest of you. Berthier, the other journalist, was attached to de Belleville, but he felt his headquarters down there off Central Avenue were too far away from the action. He really wanted to be closer to Rochambeau. So he and his brother built themselves a sylvan abode, as he described it, made by 5 soldiers' tents pitched together on a knoll in the midst of a copse of some 30 splendid trees, shading a small stream that flowed between rocks. This stream flows through my property and is identified as French Creek on many old maps. Nearby they made, and I will quote what he says, they made a couch of turf on which we could rest and read during the hottest part of the day. Opposite it was a table and several logs served as seats. Here, my dear friend, is where we spent 6 weeks of perfect happiness in Greenburgh. Isn't that nice? They even prepared themselves for a visit from George Washington by laying out maps they were studying and then escorting him to their tavern, where he rested on their turf couch and was served Madeira wine and punch. At the same time, we have the American. This is the whole encampment. These old maps are wonderful if you have the chance to study them with a magnifying glass. You can. This is the sawmill, Hudson River, and all of the troops were all the way over here. The famous tent that George Washington had with him during the entire war and is now the centerpiece of the Museum of the American Revolution was undoubtedly pitched right there where the WFAS tower is today. Washington and Rochambeau began to conduct reconnaissance missions to determine the possibilities of defeating the British in Manhattan. There were small skirmishes when patrols of the opposing side would meet each other, but nothing really large. As the days progressed, they met and they outlined how they could attack him. This is a new painting done supposedly recreating the meeting between Rochambeau and Washington in Odell House in 1781. It's owned by the Hudson River Valley Institute at Marist College, and they're allowing us to use it for some of our presentations and other things. So we're very happy to have that. As the days progressed, it became clear that even their combined forces were outnumbered. Not only did the British have more troops, their navy controlled the Hudson River. The French Navy, under the command of Admiral DeGrasse, had a large fleet of 24 ships in the Caribbean. But Admiral DeGrasse was nervous to bring it north into the Hudson River. On August 14th, 1781, a message arrived in Odell House from DeGrasse saying he would not risk bringing his fleet into New York Harbor. If Washington and Rochambeau would meet him in Virginia, he would hold the British fleet offshore. Washington gave up his plan to retake Manhattan, and with Rochambeau made the momentous decision to evade the British in Manhattan and to move all their forces south to Virginia. By August 15th, another massive troop movement began. Washington and Rochambeau did not want to alert the British that their plans had changed, so they moved all their troops across the Hudson River at night over the course of several nights. We always hear about that famous painting that I showed you, Washington crossing the Delaware at Christmas. But this crossing, he had 2,500 men crossing the Delaware. This crossing involved about 8,000 men and all those oxen and all those horses. And they had to get across the river without the British knowing what they were doing. We all know that this march to Yorktown was successful, and Cornwallis surrendered on October 19th, 1781. And here we have a very idealized version of Rochambeau. Somehow he doesn't look 56 in that painting, does he? And over here in the back with the red hair, we have Alexander Hamilton. Lafayette is there. Of course, this is George Washington. Back in Westchester, skirmishes continued throughout 1782, including a notable one involving, yet again, John Odell and Delancey. Delancey stole John Odell's horse. This was a very big deal because this horse had been given to him by his commander, one of the Van Cortlands, and it was known as the Van Cortland Gray. It was a very famous horse. Somehow he got it back. And by 1781, peace finally came to Westchester. In Hartsdale, peace reigned. The cottage, however, stood empty. The commissioners of forfeiture organized the sale of loyalist properties to patriots. John Odell had married his sweetheart, Hannah McChain, in 1785, and he bought the cottage in 1786. Interestingly enough, he had to sign a bond with Sarah Bates, just like a mortgage today, to buy the property. The bond was for £200, and I don't know if you can see this, but here's Sarah Bates' signature. This is in the Westchester County Archives. And he paid small amounts every year for about 15 years before he actually had full ownership of the house. He bought the land from the commissioners of forfeiture, and I'm not sure what he paid for that. We're still researching that one. So we now have John and Hannah living in a house that they've now added a second floor, so the house looks like this. It's much bigger. So they would have had 2 rooms on each ground floor, front and back, and now they had 2 rooms above. This has a full attic, and this has a loft that I think was reachable at that point by a ladder. I'm not sure exactly when the stairwell was put in. I see Mr. Tilley there. He's not letting me know what he knows about our architect. His brother, Abraham, lived on Appleby Farm, and he later became the first supervisor of the town of Greenburgh. He served for 21 years, so Paul has beaten his record. John's descendants had family members serving the country, starting with his son Jackson, who served in the War of 1812 when he was only 20 years old. Then his grandson Dyckman in the Civil War. Dyckman's son Otis served in the Spanish-American War, and his daughter Edna was a nurse in World War I. Dyckman built this final section of the house in 1855. By then, it was built out of stone because Dyckman had gone to Cornell University. He was quite successful, and he was able to build a fairly substantial addition. By 1965, only one direct male descendant of John Odell remained, his great-granddaughter, Elizabeth. She was a school teacher. Elizabeth dearly wanted to preserve the history of the house, and in 1965, she deeded the house to a small chapter of the Sons of the American Revolution for $1. The president of the Sons was a young man named Robert Stackpole. He had many plans to restore the house and to open it as a museum. In 1976, there was a big celebration at the house attended by the Grand Chancellor of the Legion of Honor and his wife, who was a daughter of Charles de Gaulle. They presented a bronze bust of General Rochambeau to be displayed in the house. That sits today in one of the storage units in the backyard. Letters written by Rochambeau to family in France were also given to the Sons at that time, and we do not have access to them. Sadly, in the 54 years that SAR owned it, restoration was never achieved. The past 20 years have seen terrible and rapid deterioration, which I have watched from my home on Rochambeau Drive, 3 blocks away. 2 metal storage containers were parked on the property within the last 10 years. These are pictures taken inside the house inside the containers. This is how the house looked in 1978. You see there was a kitchen, this was a chimney. They used cooking things here. If I go back, you'll see that is completely gone. Some of it fell down in a hurricane, but a lot of it just deteriorated. This is the interior of those storage containers. This supposedly is George Washington's camp cook stove. I don't know if we have any papers verifying that, but that's what we've been told. There is an antique desk. This is a large, not a musket ball. This would be some kind of a cannonball. These boxes contain all the documents that were in the house, possibly a group of papers that I've read about called the Odell family papers. There is a beautiful spinning wheel that's in the house. This is a wool winder. Evidently, the Odells raised sheep well into the 20th century. There's a lovely newspaper article I found about Elizabeth Odell reminiscing as a child when she had to go out and tend the sheep and protect them from the wild dogs in Greenburgh. And that would have been probably in the 1920s. So they were still raising sheep, shearing the wool, and possibly spinning it as late as the 20th century. Again, another view inside the container. Trunks, we don't know what's in all these boxes. Going back to that painting, you'll see that this is the mantelpiece. The mantelpiece today is still there. This is the good news. This is the original wooden mantelpiece. It needs to be restored, but it's still there. So after many years of trying to negotiate with the Sons of the American Revolution through my work with the Westchester County Historical Society and as a founding member of the Hartsdale Neighbors Association, I realized that the only way to save the house was to have the Town of Greenburgh take ownership. At the beginning of 2019, Paul Feiner and the Town Board of Greenburgh agreed to do so. We celebrated the contract signing between the Sons and the town on July 10th. The next day, I submitted my application to New York State to incorporate the nonprofit Friends of Odell House, Rochambeau Headquarters, to apply for grant funds, to solicit donations, and to reach out to groups like you to tell the story. By July 24th, we were officially incorporated as a nonprofit, and our IRS application for full 501c3 status should be approved shortly. The town received a $600,000 grant from New York State in December, a great accomplishment. It is, however, a matching grant, so we have to raise an additional $600,000. And we're going to be looking to foundations, to individuals, corporations, anybody we can find that will help us in this endeavor, because this is what needs to be done. This is what the interior of the house looks like today. This furniture, do you all remember watching the wonderful movie about Lincoln at the end of the Civil War starring Daniel Day-Lewis? I think that chair was in Lincoln's office or its match. This is what the attic looked like before the town, of its own expense, without owning the property, put a big tarp over the roof this summer, but it had leaked on all of this furniture that is up in the attic. I've been told that in 2011, a young man who's here today was taken through the property by Mr. Stackpole, and somewhere on this floor was pointed out a saddle owned by Lady Van Cortlandt. It could still be sitting there for all we know. Hopefully it is in good enough shape to restore it. Oops. Oh dear, what do I do with that? I don't have the ability to click on that. Okay, there we go. Ah, sorry, this is not my computer, as you know. Okay, so this is what needs to be done. These models, Roland Odell, who was an orphan adopted by Edna Odell when she was a nurse in France in World War I. He was 4 years old, and she adopted him and brought him back to the United States. And he lived in the house until, as a caretaker from the 70s until, I think he passed away in 1990, I'm not quite sure. And he was a carpenter, and he made models of all of the buildings that used to be on the grounds of the Odell farm. I've been told there were up to 30 different buildings on the grounds of the farm. I would love to see all those models on permanent display at Town Hall or here in the library, eventually in the museum. This, I think, would have been to have oxen attached to a plow. They're lying there somewhere in the house. And then there are trunks. There are over a dozen antique trunks scattered throughout the house. These are in the attic. To my knowledge, they've never been opened. Wouldn't you like to open one? I'm thinking of auctioning off the right to open each trunk. I think it's like, Antiques Roadshow and the treasure hunt all combined. This is another view inside. Over here is a copper kettle. My husband and I were at the New York Historical Society, and they have a display of Revolutionary artifacts, and sitting in the middle of a cabinet, perfectly lit, is a kettle, just like that one. Underneath that, we believe, is a piano. This is our signing of the contract on July 10th. Our town board members, and I just saw Diana Jutner arrive too, and I know that Francis is here and Paul. That was a great day when we signed the contract. It has taken us since July 10th until about 2 weeks ago to have the Sons submit all the proper papers to New York State to allow title to pass. But everything is now in place, and we should be able to have title pass sometime this month. We just need to update the survey. There's so many stories to be told and to be researched. For example, almost 25% of George Washington's troops were African Americans. What is their story? They may have been part of a large Rhode Island regiment, but we'd all like to know what their story was and where they came from. And they were free African Americans. What was Edna's life like in World War I as a nurse? This is a picture of Roland Odell taken in the attic in 1978. He seems to have been quite an interesting man. And what was it like for him to be brought to the United States at the age of 4? Unfortunately, Edna passed away not long after she came back with him. She died in 1921, and he was raised by his aunt, Elizabeth, in Hastings for a while, and then came back to live in the house. So this is the way the house looks today, with its nice tarp, but rather overgrown and sad, waiting. So join us to educate everyone about the importance not only of this site, but of all it stands for. It's a reminder of the fight for independence, of the honor and ideals of all who fought, and of the men and women who sacrificed to create the democracy we are privileged to have. Help us to restore it and to tell the story. Thank you. This is one of my board members.
Thank you.
Happens to be a professional photographer. So, questions? Yes?
After the title passes, what are the plans for all the furniture and the mysterious trunks and so on? Because they're in an unheated building right now, probably deteriorating further, right?
I'm not sure. I'm not an expert on antiques, but I would hate to say that moving from an unheated to a heating space is a good thing. Maybe they're preserved having been in the cold. The town was generous enough to pass a motion allowing us to employ an expert who will help us evaluate it as soon as we have access to the contents. The contents of the house and of the trailers and of the things that are in the home of the president of the American Revolution chapter are not part of the exchange. We are hoping to negotiate again we have access to them. That was under the terms of the contract. We are to be allowed to catalog them and to see what we can use, but ownership at the moment is staying with the sons. So that's another negotiation we'll do in 2020. Yes?
Susan, is the total of $1.2 million, the combination of the
Yes.
grant and the matching funds, is that just stabilize the house or is that fully restored?
Gentleman sitting behind you, Stephen Tilley, noted local architect, could probably answer that. I'll start, and Stephen, please add if there's more to say. My understanding is the first thing we have to do, obviously, is put a new roof on it, because we can't leave that tarp. It has to have a waterproof roof, it has to have the windows replaced, and it has to have the siding fixed. But before any of that can be done, the floors have to be shored up. So the town has already put out an RFP, request for proposal, for shoring contract, which will be done as soon as title passes. And that'll be a design contract. It'll take about 6 to 8 weeks to do that designing. And then they'll let the contract to stabilize the floors out. I would imagine that to create an actual museum, with finished floors and display cabinets, et cetera, will cost more than $1.2 million, but that's where we are right now.
The house is structurally sound?
Steve?
No.
Well, that's why we have to shore the floors.
It needs an immense amount of restructuring, so that the 1.2 will not get a fully restored, kind of inhabitable building. It'll be, a substantial amount will get done, and that it's a critical moment. It was a critical moment 2 or 3 years ago, so we're past, we're going to lose a fair amount of key structural members, but we'll try to keep things in place. So, and we'll have to introduce new structure. Will have to be introduced strategically
Into the walls, yeah.
arthroscopic surgery.
Right. But I think as I said, the bones, which is the wide plank floors, a lot of the woodwork, they're still there. So hopefully they can be, restored to a state that we can use them. Yes?
You're talking about stabilizing the floors before you do the roof?
I believe so. I think the first thing you have to do is make sure that any worker or anybody going in isn't going to create the possibility of a floor collapsing. Well, first we have to move the furniture out. Yeah, that's another issue. Yeah.
How should we make out our checks?
Oh, we have my husband is the treasurer. He's right there. We've actually, so far, we have gotten an amazing response. We are getting individual donations, and any donations that you make now, even though we don't quite have our 501c3, it will be retroactively tax deductible.
What is it, how should we make it out?
Here is my grant writer coming to give you a donation form.
Anybody else?
Also have a,
Yeah, make the checks out to the Friends of Odell House, Rochambeau Headquarters. You can abbreviate that as Friends of OHRH. And this is our website. All of that is on our website. It's odellrochambeau.org. And our email address is odellrochambeau@gmail.com. And we are also on Facebook. Yes?
If the SAR insists on keeping ownership of all of the furnishings and the documents, and you're gonna restore the home, and you can't do that with all that stuff in there, what plans do they have, and where is those items and those documents gonna be put for safekeeping since it's so valuable?
I'm looking at Francis Sheehan because he and I have been somewhat frustrated as the impasse that we've had with the SAR over that. I think, we've done well. Paul has done a good job, Garrett Duquesne, our Commissioner of Planning, in negotiating with Mr. Stackpole to get this far. And we feel that as time goes on, he does not have the resources himself or within the SAR to move any of the furniture or put it anywhere. So the town will offer to help him, and in exchange for that offer, there will have to be an agreement that he allow the town to have
Because
parts of the
in
collection.
the house, obviously, like the Washington headquarters, that was the Ann Fisher Miller house, was really important to restore. But in another context of history, 100 years from now, the documents.
The documents are
being
extremely
preserved
important.
And then digitized and ending up in the National Archives of American History.
I couldn't agree with you more, and it makes me feel like this.
are
At the contract,
beyond belief.
I'm sorry, at the contract signing on July 10th was when Mr. Stackpole revealed that the French government in 1976 had given him these letters from Rochambeau written back to France. And we immediately, Eric Vesselberg, the historian for RW 250, approached him and said, I'm writing a book about the revolution in Westchester. Could I come and look at them? And he was not immediately open to that idea. However, the French Consul General in New York is very involved with us. And as soon as the town owns the house, the French government is going to approach him and say, look, we gave those to you in safekeeping to be used in a museum. You need to give them back to a place where they can be publicly accessible.
Thank goodness.
Yes, did you make out your check?
I haven't made it yet, so, it's a thought about fundraising.
Yes.
So when my family years ago was in England for a year, the Titchfield Church there needed a new roof. And the pastor there, what he did was when the old beams were removed to have the new, and to raise money for, the beams were then cut and polished and all, and they had a little plaque on them, and they were made into bookends.
Uh-huh.
and they weren't perfect pieces of wood because it was rotted, you know,
Right.
some of it was, to raise funds.
Oh, I love that. That's a great idea.
So when you're talking about some of the beams might need replacing and all.
Wonderful
well,
idea.
They may have some value for fundraising.
Absolutely, and I think, please, go to our website. There's a place where you can fill out a form to volunteer with us, to give us ideas like this. If you work for a corporation that might give matching donations, there are French corporations in Westchester. There are many in the city. The French lost much of their 18th century history in their little revolution, and they don't have any of the papers and things like that. So they're very eager to see this become available for French tourism. Economically, this site could really bring some economic development to Greenburgh, because we feel that French tourism, the whole idea of historic tourism, has grown since our dear Lin-Manuel wrote Hamilton. People are very interested in the Revolution, and with the 250th anniversary of the Revolution coming up in the year 2026, we definitely expect this to be open and to be one of the centerpieces of that celebration. And we think it'll bring a lot of tourism. And what I would really like to see on one of these many parcels being discussed for development in Greenburgh is a really wonderful small hotel with a French restaurant in it, because we don't have one here, right? Yes, in the front.
The history book club is reading The Spy now.
Oh, really?
Yeah, the meeting is gonna be, the first Friday in February, I believe. So, you know, you can sign up for that online if you're interested, and The Spy, of course, is,
Right now, I just read old French journals a lot. Yeah. Right.
Sorry, what's the book? The book is The Spy by James Fenimore Cooper. It was his second book, and it's set here in Westchester. And the book club is going to be it's usually the first Friday in February. They meet every 3 months.
The spy.
White Plains is it was at the Purdy House. Do you know the Purdy House? Okay, well, if you look online, does anybody get the White Plains Historical Newsletter? That's how we heard about it, yeah. And so these people are all online. But
Just-
if you want to.
Just so just to build on that a little bit, James Fenimore Cooper knew John Jay. Supposedly, John Jay was the leader of a spy network in Westchester during the war. It's a little vague as to whether or not Cooper actually based it on that, but certainly the idea came from his friendship with John Jay. Yes,
There is a follow-up book to The Spy called The Spy Unmasked,
yes,
and that's about
right, written by H.L. Mencken,
about Enoch Crosby.
right.
Whose house was built in 1789 in Greenburgh and still stands. And they didn't know he was the spy until he filed for a pension about in the 1810 to 1820 period. But he was the character in James Fenimore Cooper's The Spy. Also, the book, The Spy, if anybody's interested and they have a Kindle, it's a free download
Right,
on Kindle, so you don't have to pay for it.
it's free. Oh, very good.
And I have one last question, if I can follow up on that. Delancey, the loyalist,
Yes.
James Fenimore Cooper married Susan Delancey, is that the same?
It could be. They were a huge family. I found out the other day there was a lecture here about the neutral ground in the Bronx. Delancey's mill was where the Asia ride is in the Bronx Zoo, just so you know, that's where he was from. Yeah, his family, James's mother was Sarah, and she came from, they were very, very wealthy family and very well known in Westchester. Yes,
What motivates the sons to be so, let's shall we say, uncooperative?
I wish I could answer that question. I'm not inside his mind. I just think that right now, he perhaps has changed his mind, realizing that he wasn't able to accomplish what he had hoped to. And with Paul's persuasion, realized that the best way to preserve this was to give it to the town.
But all the content.
We'll get there. I am pathologically optimistic. Yes, Chris?
The Friends of the Odell House, I think, are doing events in June, correct?
Yes, we have an event already planned on June the 14th. It will be sponsored by the Town of Greenburgh, and we're organizing it. It will be called Odell House Colonial Day at Ridge Road Park, and it will be a time for all the families in the area to come. We're going to have colonial reenactors. I'm definitely going to have a woman spinning wool, hopefully using one of the spinning wheels. We have probably going to have a reenactor of George Washington and of Rochambeau at the house. And we are negotiating with the county to reestablish the trail that existed up until 2013. There was a trail that went from Odell House to Ridge Road Park. And they used to lead walks called the Rochambeau Ramble through that trail, because it theoretically was where Rochambeau and Washington would have gone back and forth. You can walk in Ridge Road Park now, and if you go to the end of the road when you come on, there's a path that goes out to Seacourt Road and would go right to where Appleby Farm was. Sadly, Appleby Farm burned down in the beginning of the 20th century, but we don't want that to happen to Odell. So, all right. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And, I have one more thing. I did bring, in case you were interested, Westchester County has published 2 wonderful books of the history of Westchester. There's a large pictorial book called Picturing Our Past that is a record of every National Register site in Westchester. And they just published this year a history of Westchester County that has a very big section on the 17th century. So we have a few copies for sale if you'd like to buy them. Okay, thank you again.